He overheard my affair, call him a loser through a hidden microphone, and stormed home with a hammer. I never thought my life would turn into a story worthy of Reddit, but here I am, pouring my heart out to strangers on the internet. My name is Vivian, and I'm a 32-year-old woman living what seemed like the perfect life with my husband, Mark, who's also 32. We've been married for 6 years now, and while we don't have kids yet, we've been talking about starting a family soon. Mark and I met in college, and from the moment we laid eyes on each other, I knew he was the one. He was charming, ambitious, and incredibly supportive. It was just your typical love story. We spent hours chatting about our dreams, laughing like crazy and falling hard for each other. Fast forward a bit, and we decide to shack up together. Found a cozy apartment downtown and started building our life. Those early days were a mix of excitement and challenges. Mark was hustling at his job, trying to climb the corporate ladder like there was no tomorrow. Meanwhile, I was doing the stay-at-home wife thing and making our place feel like home. A few years down the road, we decided to tie the knot surrounded by family and friends. Everything felt perfect, like we were on top of the world. But little did I know, my stupid mistake was about to rock our world in ways I never imagined. Years went by, and things were even better. Mark had soared up the corporate ladder, and our financial situation was pretty darn good. I was still holding down the fort as a stay-at-home mom, and things were going smoothly on that front too. But let me be real here, folks. With Mark's job keeping him crazy busy, I found myself feeling pretty darn lonely most of the time. Don't get me wrong, we cherished our time together. But between his long hours and business trips, there were plenty of moments when it was just me and the TV for company. But I couldn't complain because that was the only downside to our otherwise perfect life. Well, you know how the story goes. Life was good, but somewhere along the line I started to get bored. I mean, don't get me wrong, I loved being a stay-at-home mom. Watching our beautiful home transform into a cozy nest, cooking meals for Mark, and having the freedom to pursue my hobbies. It was all great. But there comes a point when routine starts to feel like a prison, you know? Mark was out there, conquering the business world, while I was stuck in this suburban bubble, feeling like I was slowly fading into the background. I missed the excitement, the thrill of new experiences, the sense of purpose beyond just keeping the house in order. Sure, I tried to shake things up. I joined a book club, took up painting classes, even started a little side hustle selling homemade candles online. But no matter what I did, there was always this nagging feeling of emptiness, like something was missing from my life. And then there were the nights. The endless nights spent lying awake in bed, listening to the rhythmic sound of Mark's breathing beside me, wondering if this was all there was to life, wondering if I was destined to spend the rest of my days trapped in this suburban purgatory, yearning for something more. I should have talked to Mark about how I was feeling, about the loneliness that gnawed at me day in and day out. But I didn't want to seem ungrateful. After all, Mark was trying his best. He was busy, sure, but on the few times and days he was home, he always made sure to devote his total attention to me. His hugs were warm, his kisses tender, and his laughter infectious. Even when he was buried under a mountain of work at the office, he never failed to call, just to check in and make sure I was okay. It was those little gestures that kept me going, that reassured me that no matter how busy life got, I was still his top priority. But despite his efforts, the loneliness lingered, a constant companion that refused to be ignored. And little did I know, it was about to push me into making a grave mistake. That was when I met Jackson. Jackson was the plumber. I had honestly never met him before, but we had a little issue and my husband had to call him in. Of course, my husband was busy. So I was the only one at home when Jackson came. He arrived with his toolbox in hand, a friendly smile on his face that instantly put me at ease. I couldn't help but notice how attractive he was, with his rugged good looks and easygoing charm. It was a stark contrast to the suits and ties of the corporate world that Mark was always clad in. As he went about fixing the issue, we struck up a conversation. Jackson was easy to talk to, and before I knew it, we were laughing and joking like old friends. It felt good to have someone to talk to, someone who wasn't wrapped up in their own world of deadlines and meetings. But as much as I enjoyed our conversation, there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling of guilt gnawing at my insides. Here I was, enjoying the company of another man while my husband was out there, working his butt off to provide for us. I brushed off the feeling, chalking it up to harmless flirting. After all, it wasn't like anything would ever come of it, right? Jackson was just the plumber, a passing acquaintance who would soon be on his way. Little did I know that chance encounter with Jackson would set off a chain of events that would shake the very foundation of my life. Jackson fixed our sink real quick, and he was good at it too. After he left, I figured that would be the last I'd see of him. But then, I started bumping into Jackson all over town. Our town wasn't huge, but it wasn't tiny either. You know, the kind of place where you might see a familiar face at the grocery store, but not everyone you know every time. So it was kind of surprising to keep seeing Jackson around. The first time was at the grocery store, not long after he'd fixed our sink. I was pretty surprised to see him there, and even more shocked when he called out to me. But then I thought it was quite silly of me to be surprised. It was the grocery store, after all. Everyone came here to shop. I approached him, and we exchanged greetings. He flirted with me, even complimenting my hair and clothes. That made me smile, to be honest, because I had just done my hair, and my husband hadn't even noticed. But Jackson had noticed. I was flattered, of course. Jackson was very handsome. And as we chatted, I found myself drawn to his easy smile and charming demeanor. Despite the awkwardness of our brief encounter, Jackson had a way of making conversation flow effortlessly. It was as if there was an invisible force pulling us towards each other, creating a magnetic connection that made it hard to part ways. In those moments, I couldn't help but feel a touch of excitement mingled with guilt. After all, I was a married woman, and these feelings were entirely inappropriate and wrong. I mean, what would my husband think? Even though I hadn't physically cheated, wasn't that emotional cheating? But no matter how hard I tried to brush it off as mere attraction, there was an undeniable chemistry between us. Looking back now, I realized that stupid attraction wasn't love or anything. It was lust, plain and simple. Lust grows, you know. And the neglect and loneliness were starting to get to me, though I didn't fully realize it at the time. After that day, I started running into Jackson more often. It seemed like everywhere I went, there he was. I even bumped into him at the local gym. Sure, we had a home gym. Mark was making good money, as I mentioned, but I found myself drawn to the public gym. It was partly because I craved human interaction in the midst of my loneliness, and partly because I discovered I enjoyed the motivation that came from working out alongside others. Being alone in our home gym, while quiet, often left me feeling lethargic and uninspired. But when there were others around, I found myself pushing harder, fueled by the energy of those around me. Plus, I'll admit, I liked the opportunity to people watch, even if I was too shy to strike up conversations. So, there I was, at the gym, feeling surprised to run into Jackson again. We exchanged surprised greetings, both seemingly caught off guard by meeting each other again. I mentioned never seeing Jackson before, and he mused that the reason why I hadn't ever seen him at the gym was because I didn't know him, and so I never noticed his face. We exchanged pleasantries and even chatted for a lengthier period than last time at the grocery store. After that, I started going to the gym regularly. I liked the gym, but I didn't go as regularly as I would have liked. Not because I was busy, but because I just got bored sometimes. However, because of Jackson, I started going every day. I noticed that Jackson woke up super early to get to the gym, so it would still be very quiet by the time he arrived. And you know what? I started doing that too. It was as if I was just unconsciously gravitating towards him. I would pretend to walk by him just to strike up a conversation, and I noticed he did that sometimes too. Jackson and I became very close friends. We realized we had a lot in common. Jackson was funny and could effortlessly make me laugh. Plus, he was very attractive too. I craved human interaction, and I convinced myself that we weren't really doing anything wrong. We were just being friends, of course. We started going out for dinner after a workout just to decompress, we said. We began doing all sorts of activities together, and we would always justify it by saying we were just friends. Whether it was flexing at the gym, grabbing dinner, or simply spending time together, we chalked it up to our friendship. At some point, though, I knew deep down that what I was doing was wrong. I was becoming emotionally invested in Jackson, and that in itself felt like cheating. But I was way too far gone. I needed the interaction. In fact, I craved it. It all finally came to a head one day when Jackson started complaining about the public gym. He said he didn't like it much, as it was always quite noisy. I knew I shouldn't have done this, but I made the most stupid decision ever, and I suggested that Jackson use our private gym at home. Jackson was very happy when I suggested he use our private gym. He thanked me profusely and expressed his genuine excitement about the idea. Inquisitive as ever, Jackson asked me why I never used the private gym at our house. I simply brushed it off, saying that I enjoyed people watching and the motivation from working alongside others at the public gym. To my surprise, he nodded in understanding, sharing that he felt the same way. As our conversation continued, I mentioned that I would have to ask my husband for permission first. Jackson agreed, saying it was the right thing to do. Deep down, I knew my husband would never agree to it, but I needed a few more days to contemplate if I truly wanted to pursue anything further with Jackson. During our conversation, I noticed how impressed Jackson seemed by my husband, particularly his financial wealth. He expressed his admiration, saying he hoped to achieve the same level of financial freedom one day. I was flattered, of course. Even though I wasn't the one with the money, it still felt good to be admired. I had been with my husband for years, through thick and thin, and witnessing his journey from struggling to financially stable was indeed impressive. However, it was bittersweet. Along the path to financial freedom, it seemed like he had forgotten about me and our relationship. Returning home, I mulled over the conversation with Jackson. His excitement about using our private gym was very cute. I couldn't bring myself to tell him that my husband had said no. Instead, I rationalized that I didn't have to be in the gym with him all the time. I could simply let him work out and leave. I convinced myself that nothing would happen between us, and we would remain just friends helping each other out. But deep down, I knew that wasn't entirely true. Despite my best efforts to suppress it, there was a growing attraction between us that I couldn't ignore. Ignoring my inner turmoil, I told Jackson yes, and he was ecstatic. He eagerly asked when he could start, and I assured him he could begin anytime he liked. Jackson arrived the next day, and before his arrival, I meticulously prepared a timetable. I outlined the specific days I wanted him to come for his workouts. The reason behind my precise planning was simple. I didn't want my husband to come home unexpectedly and find Jackson there. I knew he wouldn't react well, to say the least. However, I didn't disclose this reason to Jackson. Instead, I casually mentioned that I wouldn't be around on those particular days, or that I would be occupied with other tasks. Jackson had no problem with that. He was a very easygoing person, I had noticed, and he agreed immediately. His job was flexible, and he kind of dictated his hours since he was a plumber and didn't work under anybody. Jackson started coming over to work out, and at first, I tried to keep my distance. I would occasionally go over to check on him, but I made sure to maintain some level of separation because I didn't want things to escalate between us. However, as you must have already guessed, that proved to be harder than I thought. Before I knew it, I started crossing boundaries with Jackson. Sometimes I would go over and work out alongside him, enjoying the shared experience and the opportunity to spend time together. Other times I would go simply to keep him company, relishing in his presence despite my internal conflict. And then there were moments when I would bring him drinks, even though I knew he brought his own water. It was a small gesture, but it allowed me to feel closer to him, to prolong our interactions just a little bit longer. Plus, Jackson was very charming, and he even told me that he enjoyed our interactions. This went on for a few days, and I was even surprised that Mark hadn't noticed it at all. But I chalked it up to my skill at hiding it well. One day Jackson came over to work out as usual, but unlike other times, he didn't leave early. Instead, he said he wanted to stay and keep me company. Jackson and I talked at length and in depth. He mused about how lonely I must be since my husband was always away at work. Jackson observed that ever since he had been coming to work at our private gym, he had never once met Mark. He said that showed just how busy of a person Mark was. I agreed with him and confessed that indeed I was lonely. I explained to Jackson that my family lived in another state, and I had always been the quiet kid growing up, so I barely had any friends. While I was on good terms with my family, no amount of calls, video calls, or FaceTimes could ever replace seeing them face-to-face regularly. I tried my best to visit them, but it was usually only during holidays. Although they made efforts to visit me as well, their busy work schedules limited their free time. Jackson and I continued chatting, And honestly, I cannot go into further details because it all happened so quickly. One thing led to another, and before we knew it, we kissed. It was as if every trace of desire and frustration in us was relieved right then. We became intimate right there on the couch. I had finally crossed the boundary I said I wouldn't. Of course, once the veil of desire had cleared from my eyes, I realized that what I had done was really wrong. I had cheated on my husband, the man I loved so deeply. Yes, I was attracted to Jackson, but my love for my husband ran much deeper. We had weathered storms together, and no one could ever replace him in my heart. However, I couldn't deny the intense satisfaction I felt after becoming intimate with Jackson. It was as if every frustration within me had been released. I finally understood just how neglected I had been for so long. This was what I had been missing out on. Despite my guilt, I couldn't shake the feeling that my needs mattered too. Like every other foolish person who cheated, I convinced myself that what my husband didn't know wouldn't hurt him. I made the decision that he would never find out about my indiscretion. I became meticulous in my planning. I always knew when my husband was due to come home, and I made sure Jackson and I never met on those days. I even went so far as to inform Jackson of my husband's usual schedule, ensuring that our encounters were carefully timed. It became a routine for us. He would come to the gym, and afterward, we would have sex. Our routine kept going, with Jackson showing up at the gym, followed by our secret meetings. Despite feeling guilty, I couldn't resist the excitement. Each time we met, it felt like a quick fix for the emptiness inside me, even though I knew it was wrong. As time went on, keeping our affair hidden became harder. I was constantly afraid of getting caught, but I couldn't bring myself to end things with Jackson. The thrill of sneaking around was addictive, making me ignore the consequences. Deep down, I knew I was living a lie, a betrayal to my husband and myself. No matter how I tried to justify it, I couldn't escape the truth. I had betrayed the person I loved the most. I guess they say all good things must come to an end, and karma has a way of hitting back hard. But honestly, I thought I'd be the one to end things before they caught up with me. I had this inner pact that the moment I felt tired of the chase or sensed my husband was getting suspicious, I'd call it quits with Jackson. Sure, I was growing distant from my husband, but I didn't think he was on to me just yet. On the day it all unraveled, things started off fine. You know, the worst days often begin with everything seeming okay. My husband had been home the night before, but he had to leave early in the morning. Despite the growing distance between us, I still tried to bid him goodbye warmly. He seemed fine, and we even had dinner together. I cooked, and we watched a bit of a movie before he left. Then, Jackson showed up at the gym as usual. I'd noticed he was getting a bit pushy lately. His friendliness had just been a facade, but I was already too deep in this mess to argue or have long conversations with him. I just nodded along, and that's when things took a turn for the worse. After Jackson finished his workout, we ended up in the bedroom. Yeah, I know, on my matrimonial bed. Please, spare me the judgment. After our intimate moment, Jackson and I started talking as usual. I mentioned that my husband had just left the night before, and Jackson asked if we had been intimate. I told him no, explaining that I wasn't in the mood and had told my husband as much. Jackson laughed and called my husband a loser, accusing him of neglecting his home in pursuit of financial freedom. I wanted to defend my husband because, honestly, I knew he tried his best. No matter how busy he was, he always made an effort to be there for me. But arguing with Jackson didn't seem worth it at that moment. Jackson finished showering and got dressed. He knew I didn't like him lingering around the house too much. I also never walked him to the car because I didn't want any of my neighbors spotting us together. It was rare since most of the houses were gated, but I didn't want to take any risks. However, just a few seconds after Jackson walked out, I heard screaming at the gate. I ran out, thinking maybe Jackson had gotten into some trouble. But to my shock, I found my husband angrily staring at Jackson, holding a hammer in his hand. I've never felt so scared in my life. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how much my husband knew, how much I could lie about and get away with it. Did he know? Why did he have a hammer? Did he suspect me elsewhere? Jackson looked terrified, and he looked like he was about to faint. I guess my husband finally made his move. I was frozen, shocked, not knowing what to say or do. I just prayed that the neighbors weren't watching and that I could salvage my marriage. Mark finally dropped the hammer and told Jackson to leave. Jackson drove away as fast as he could. I decided to play it safe and pretend as if nothing had happened. I approached my husband, welcomed him home, and tried to make light of the situation. But Mark wasn't having any of it. He recalled what had happened with Jackson and told me never to touch him again. He gave me 5 minutes to pack my things and leave, only allowing me to take my clothes and important documents, nothing else. He screamed at me and said I had just stayed mute while Jackson had called him a loser. That's when I realized my husband must have planted cameras or microphones in the bedroom. Mark confirmed it, saying he had suspected my infidelity for weeks and had been on to me. He unleashed a torrent of insults and accusations, saying he wouldn't waste his time with me anymore. Then he got back in his car and drove into the driveway. And so began the downward spiral of my life. Our shameless neighbors started emerging from their gates, eager to catch a glimpse of the drama unfolding. They didn't even bother hiding their curiosity. They just stood there staring. I pleaded with Mark as soon as he stepped out of the car, but he wasn't having any of it. I begged, I cried, I did everything I could to salvage our marriage. I love Mark, and what happened with Jackson was just a misunderstanding. But he refused to listen, and it seemed like the more I tried to explain, the angrier he became. After a futile attempt to reason with him, Mark screamed that my time was up and started throwing my clothes out of the drawer. That was when I realized the severity of the situation. I had to leave. I begged for a few more minutes to pack, and then I hastily gathered my personal belongings and clothes. I held on to a sliver of hope that maybe I could come back and talk things out, but Mark quickly dashed that. He told me he was clearing our joint account and leaving me with just enough money for a few days in a hotel. He told me to go back to my parents and called me useless, saying I belonged on the streets. Of course, I was devastated and I continued crying. I reminded Mark that my parents lived in another state. He softened slightly and acknowledged that that was why he was providing money for a few days at the hotel. Despite everything, he insisted he wasn't heartless, but he urged me to leave. With a heavy heart, I obeyed. It was the least I could do to ease his burden. I had to leave, even if it was just for a few days until my parents could send me money for a ticket home. Mark made it clear we were getting a divorce, adamant that not even a divine intervention from heaven could change his mind. He vowed to send divorce papers to me no matter where I ended up, even if it meant sending them to the ends of the earth. And of course, Jackson blocked me so I couldn't go to him. I think Mark had scared him a little too much with the hammer. I assured him I wouldn't evade the divorce proceedings. I just didn't want to be homeless. And with that, it was over. So I guess the moral of the story is, don't cheat. It will destroy you. And please, spare me your judgment. I know many of you have done far worse than I have. I've had plenty of time to reflect on my actions, and I know I was in the wrong. So, yeah, thanks for listening.